is episode 17 of Narrative Wake. I should probably stop doing that. I don't know why I'm doing that on the feature series where it's like general topics. Because if you saw the last one, it says it's fucking episode 9, and I just said it for like 2 months. So probably should learn from that. This isn't actually a TV show, and I'm not from the 1950s. It's the internet, and people can watch stuff whenever they want. So it's not even relevant, is it? It's not a show. No one's like, oh, but I haven't watched the 16 episodes before. Who is this Kelsey Moser character, and why is she here? Although actually, ironically, the second question is asked quite a lot. It has nothing to do with this. The episode 17 now. It's just one of the themes of the show. In many ways, it's actually the subtext of the show. Who is Kelsey Moser? Well, let's find out. Let's find out one day what Narrative Wake means and who Kelsey Moser is. Maybe we'll finish that quest. So, having started that quest, usual host, Thorin, sponsored by Esports Pools. Any reason I should say that? No. There's barely even any League of Legends tournaments going on, but it might be the case that there's all-stars on there. I haven't checked. I'm not going to say I'm like the most dedicated person or anything, but I mentioned that's the basic minimum requirement. So that's the end of that segment. Hope it was worth your money. Right. So, usual co-host, Kelsey Moser, of the aforementioned subtitle, Who in the World is Kelsey Moser? Better title, actually. I made it better there. Guests for this show are going to be Youngbuck, former coach of G2 Esports, where he won just the 4 ULCS titles. But, you know, for all you newer fans who think, right, so okay, one of the most storied, decorated coaches of all time, a champion, probably a fantastic mind for the game, good motivator. No, you know, you got to remember everything he did in his career. He also was like perma-hard stock in Masters when Forgiven was like the best player in Europe and dragging him down as kind of a bit of a dead weight, you know. But the thing is, killing it on Twitter, killing it with the personal game where actually, ironically, Forgiven was hard stock in Masters. So, you know, it's just the counterbalance of the different aspects of League and how we succeed. So it's actually quite an inspirational story that he became such a great coach, and everyone forgot that first part that I just mentioned there, which might not even be true, but that is sort of the currency in which I deal. You know, it's sort of like a Bitcoin. It goes up and down depending on the days. Other guest, final guest, is the man who has, as far as I can tell, every time he ever did a good draft, no one ever mentioned the draft, and his players were just amazing. And every time his team ever lost the game, his draft basically was just like a scroll on a McDonald's napkin that said, lose the game. That's basically what I've learned from Reddit. Right? I haven't watched a lot of games in a long time, you know. I think I've nailed it, though. That seems like exactly the factual basis for it, because as we all know, everyone on Reddit actually has a very deep analytical understanding of the game, as we all find out when they critique all of us and our weak understandings of the game, because, you know, there's a lot of wisdom out there. And so speaking of a lot of wisdom, we all know in League of Legends that coaching has been an evolution within the West. So people might remember the first coach, as far as I can remember, was actually Monty, which was like season 3 summer when he came in for CLG and he was doing it remotely. We had coaches by season 4. We had Locodoco. We had a few others in the mix there, you know. Eventually now we're at the point where everyone has coaches. Riot themselves played a part in that by providing a stipend. And so now every team, no matter how good, how bad, has this context of who is the coach, what's their philosophy, how's it working? And then within that, I've noticed, as I joked with the Parth thing there, coaches now also get blame. Like it's not just what people did in the game that fucked up the match. People now also think the coaches play a role in whether the West can compete with Korea, etc. So it's a pretty broad topic. We're talking about coaching in the West here. So let me start here. Parth, you are the silent man, the man who has only tweeted mildly. What I liked is, even when you did sort of the emo tweet, there wasn't that much emotion in it, though. You were just sort of like, well, see you guys. I'm out. You know, like, no one's really heard a lot from you. So explain this to me. When people bring up a broad topic like coaching in the West, does it immediately make you think of positive things? Like, we're really advanced now, it's come a long way. What's the first thing you think of?
I think there's just a very big disparity between what they think coaching is and what actually exists. They think that just because we've now like slapped on these titles onto people like, oh, this team now has a head coach, assistant coach, analysts, we now have the same structure that like Korean teams do, who've had like this structure built up for the last 10 years. And so there's a lot of misconceptions of coaching, which hopefully we'll explore today.
Yes. Okay. So Youngbuck, can you give me one straight away? What's a big example of something where fans perhaps naively think a coach does this or doesn't do this, and it's really not part of coaching, or there's something more behind it. There must be something that triggers you.
Well, mostly for other teams, it's when the draft is lost, it's 100% the coach. When the game is won, or the draft is won, it's just that the players are really good. And I think it's very different for each team. G2 did have a style where I had the power to decide the picks, but I know there are a lot of teams where the players do most of the draft.
Okay, well, that's a good topic right there. So everyone can jump in on this one, because obviously the big problem is, I've noticed, the general consensus people have is, here's the thing, I don't blame fans entirely. If you don't have information, it creates a vacuum, and people will always project into the vacuum whatever they know, basically, and think to themselves, because they don't know what they don't know, well, this is all that's known. So, in a sense, the fact that Riot has the whole aspect where you come up on stage and you have the book and then you shake hands and stuff, people naturally think that the coach is in charge of all these aspects, So, within your teams, for example, okay, so Youngbuck, you had a lot of control. Parth, did you have full control over a draft if you wanted?
I think it's a similar system where on stage I have the final say in everything, but before we go on stage, the priorities are decided as a more collaborative effort.
Okay. What should we say about this topic then? Come on, get into it a bit.
So I mean, I can distinguish between the two, right? On stage, you only have 30 seconds. To a minute, depending on like which band scenario it is, where you have to decide what you're going to end up doing. So most teams, most successful teams that I know of, have one person who is in charge of making the final call on a lot of the picks, and the order in which they're going to be picked based on the scenario that's unfolding. But I'm pretty sure 99% of teams, before they go into draft, discuss, this is the priorities we're going to go into, this is what certain scenarios are going to maybe happen, and this is how we're going to react to them. So the misconception here is one person at all times tells the team what to do, but that's not necessarily the case. It's always like split up between everyone putting in their input and then one person deciding at some point along the way.
In that sense, I've kind of thought of the coaching as a collaborative effort where everyone has this discussion and it's the coach's job to remind players what has already been said, right? So if a player like panic decides that, oh, we lost this game, I'm only going to play Talia or something this game, you remind them and says, no, you didn't, we agreed, you're not going to play Talia into this matchup, you're not going to play Talia into this composition. So I think that's kind of generally how I view it when people talk about the draft process.
Okay. Right, in one of your teams, Youngbuck, would it be that, for example, you have a similar setup? You've got your rough idea of the priorities. Generally, based on what's available, what you probably want to pick for the comp, right? In the actual live on-stage moment, not before the game, like, coach, pick me this, but in the live moment, do you let players actually potentially short-circuit what you had in mind if they say, I really want this, actually, I don't want that, I've decided to change my mind? Can they on stage change their mind?
Yeah, depending on the situation though, but it happens very regularly that a player will say, in this matchup, I can play this or I can play that. And then I am still given the decision, but I know what options I have or what I know they want to play. And if they give me two options that I don't want them to play and I want to give them a third option, so I would tell them myself like, hey, maybe Talia is good here. This is something that happens frequently in mid lane where we were very prepared in the first phase of the draft, but the second phases, there's so many different kind of outcomes where you have to kind of wing it a lot of the times. So for mid lane and top lane, a lot of times I would just throw them options and then he would say, well, I would really like this or this, what fits better? And then I make the final call in the 30 seconds that we have.
Parth, what about for you? Do you play, like, for example, okay, I'll just give you the ridiculous version and you reply to that. So sure. In the mind of fans, in the game, even if like they think that Parth just picks everything, because as I said, they don't want to blame their beloved star player, whether that be Double Lift or Bjergsen or whatever. But presumably, if a scenario occurs based on what you picked, that Bjergsen says, actually, I've changed my mind, I'd rather pick this now because he's picked that already, or I think it'll just work better. How much input does he get?
It depends on the scenario. Like Youngbuck said, in the second phase of the draft, usually there's a lot of different scenarios that you have to go through and a lot of potential picks that are either picked or banned. So that's like the biggest spot where you might ask for feedback. But at least on our team, the person who's also making the decisions also trains in scrims in terms of doing the pick ban. And so the responsibility of the pick ban for us was still on me. So if that makes sense. And going into a little bit what Youngbuck said too, the variability in letting the players choose versus you like just going and sticking to the plan also depends on like a series, because when you go into like your first game or second game of the series, you have a pretty set idea of what you want to do and how you want to play. But as the series goes on, the priorities change, and that's when the players have a lot more input, even on stage, because I think emotions and certain matchups that have worked in the past change as like the series or the day goes on.
Okay. So are both of you of the, what's your take on this perspective then? Because obviously a key topic is kind of like to differentiate like Parth did there. It's different if it's just like a game in the regular season, you know? But if you're playing like a playoff series, for example, that's where you hear most of the famous anecdotes that either work out or they don't. People usually do it for both sides. Like, you know, oh yeah, when we lost the game, the player asked me for that champion. Or when you win, it's obviously a better story. Like, you know, he said, oh, actually I can play this. And then we'd never played it before and he won on it. How much... Are you of the philosophy that you let players have kind of comfort picks when it's a really important game like that?
I think it's dependent on the player and the situation. For example, at 2016 Worlds, I think I made a mistake by when we opened against CLG and we put all our eggs in the top lane basket. And I knew he was nervous when he first played in the LCS with us in that same split. And I knew he was very nervous when he played the first playoff match. That split. So looking back, I definitely should not have drafted for top lane in the first opening match of Worlds. So depending on the player, depending on the person, I would say a comfort pick is necessary, or maybe not so necessary, or just make sure that they don't have a lot of influence on the outcome of the game and just draft very 5-5 kind of way.
You have to know what to expect.
Would you consider that more of, I guess, a planning flaw then? Because I remember when I did an interview with you recently, we talked a little bit about 2016 Worlds, and you said that your team basically trained for top lane for that tournament effectively, like to play around this top lane side. So was it just like a breakdown and understanding the expectations on expect? Do you think that just in general, like there are obviously a lot of factors that go into this, but my question, I guess, would be like, is this more of a planning factor or just on the day not reacting in this situation?
I think it was us having a very wrong read on the meta at the time. So we actually thought the game had to be played through top lane, and we've always had the philosophy that we just played the meta, and we're not just gonna break it and suddenly play towards another lane, even if it's not meta. So we thought playing for top lane was the meta. Looking back, it was both the wrong meta, but I also think that we shouldn't have put Expect in a position where he had to carry us.
Okay. I mean, this has to be very topical for you in the kind of situation you were just in now, Parth, right? Which is that people will ask, this is one of the problems I notice when fans analyze, is that a lot of people take the concept of global meta, I think, too far. Like, it's not like I don't think it exists. It's just that if you don't have the tools to necessarily play that exact style or those compositions or those champions, you might in fact obviously do worse in the game if you pick that as opposed to something else. And obviously within any meta, it suggests a counter which won't itself be the meta but will still be viable. So what's your take on that? Is that something have you always subscribed to that? Is there more grey area than I'm making out there? What do you think?
I mean, I think every team or at least every team that makes Worlds to a certain extent plays to a global meta. And then based on like the unique strengths of their team, they stray from it a little bit. So they might have like a few extra carry champions in our role or a few extra pocket picks that they're willing to break out. Like C9 had Aurelion Sol. We had the Jace top that we broke out in the last game. So I still believe that, yeah, a classic. I actually did not realize, ironically, that happened until after the match was over. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think everyone who approaches international tournament can definitely stray away from a global meta a little bit if they want to, but for comfort. But that should be on top of the meta that's already been played. Okay. Rather than instead of. Which is why I thought it was super surprising that teams like, I mean, I can be challenged by teams like Misfits and Fnatic who actually got a lot or found a lot more success playing their own meta this Worlds than teams like us and G2 who stuck more to a global meta.
Okay, so then what do you think of that then? Because obviously, like, Misfits is the best example because obviously at the support position, they basically just said, like, fuck them, and PS, we probably couldn't have played it anyway. You know, like, they went their own route, and either they were going to go out in a blaze of glory, or they were just going to go out. That was it. It was one of the two, right? So what's your take on that?
I can take it.
Do you want to? Yeah.
So I don't even think they were playing off meta that much. A lot of teams were playing these kind of supports where you have to snowball early or you have to put pressure on the bot lane and then roam a lot to mid lane. However, usually when you go into a tournament, this style doesn't work because people play very safe, they make very little mistakes, so they get through the early game very easily and then just overrun you in the late game. Misfits decided to just fuck it and just play completely through the early game, through the early pressure. And you could see in a lot of games they had huge leads, 7k, 8k leads against World Elite, I think, and still couldn't finish the game just because of their composition. And in other games, they did actually manage to close out the games from those leads.
And I think it's a bit unique because I do think because of one particular item, it was really hard to refer to like the bot snowball as something that was viable within the meta. I mean, even when you're picking like the karma that still has the item in question. Why am I blanking on the item name? Anyway, yes, Ardent Sensor. Yes.
I thought you were doing some like Voldemort shit there. Like I thought you were pretty meta.
You don't mention it.
Yeah, it must not be named.
We're just
it still exists. Okay.
Yeah. So even in those cases, karma will get outscaled in these scenarios. So it's still like an early game composition centered around this. It still has a lot of problems. You'll still have deficiencies as it gets progressively later on, and they have their support. The point is that I think that it's like difficult to call it that. However, I do think like, because when you guys played your very first match, it was like the second match of the entire tournament. You did play with like the Alistair Ivern. So you then went for, you didn't do that again. Is kind of how I perceived it. So obviously you reacted by saying, okay, this isn't working. Maybe either because of that moment, because it didn't work in the first game, or because you just decided it wasn't meta. But I was wondering if you now think that may have been a mistake, or you should have tried that more in the group stage.
No, I think we really liked our draft, and every single pick except for the last pick, we knew from the start we had a dream scenario, and they locked in everything we dreamt of. But our biggest problem was that we didn't play through bot lane that game, and we last picked Shen, which I think wasn't terrible, but there were better options into Cho'Gath. And then we had Shen, which is perfectly fine. We have a winning bot lane. Usually Alistar Xayah, I believe, against Tarik Varus, should be able to pressure, but needs a lot of jungle attention. And we were ganking top lane, which in the early game, like first 5 levels, which was fine. But then we weren't able to translate the lead in top lane to a bot lane play. So we were taking the enemy red buff on top side, which gave their bot lane a lot of free time to pressure and just slowly outscale, because once they get to Rageblade, the lane is actually over. But we should have been able to take the tower before then. But we kept playing towards top side, and they just got vision on our bot side for the entire game, completely controlled the early game because of that, despite us getting ganks up. And so we just didn't play through our win condition. But I think looking back, we could have played it again. We discussed playing it again, but it was just the meta to play more late game. So we strayed away from the Alistar and just went for the Lulu. And, you know, the lanes may have not been strong, but we were confident that if people were going to play Blitzcrank against us or something crazy like that, we would have just been able to outscale even if they got in a tower.
One thing that's a bit abstract I wanted to ask you about was when people try to analyze, obviously, listen, I realize people can't analyze in a lot of depth because usually they're doing it live on Twitter, and even if it's someone very knowledgeable, you know, it's a throwaway comment like this was bad or whatever. They can't go into the massive detail of an essay like you'd hope. But when people analyze like that, even other coaches and other players, I feel like unconsciously we don't always realize that we're setting in place a sort of almost the implication that because this draft was bad, it was always possible for someone to have gotten a good draft. And especially the part that's confusing to me, I want to ask this, it's quite abstract, is, right, is it that Western coaches, for some reason, don't have as good a control over the draft? Because obviously, once you go into the world of watching LCK, where it's only Korean teams, suddenly you have people telling me that Katie Rolster's draft was garbage, and then Samsung's draft in this game was garbage. So it's like presumably there isn't just one magical draft, like that meme of that scroll that you have to search 15 years for, you know, and only one guy finds it. Like, to what degree is it even possible to get a good draft most times, and how much kind of wiggle room is there in this respect?
I think it's usually most drafts end up being somewhere between 40-60, at least in my opinion.
I've kind of asked a few teams like how long their pre-game drafting sessions are, like how many hours do they spend, things like this. So I was kind of curious if you guys would be willing to share that, or.
Sure. We'd usually, it depends on like if it's a regular season match or a match towards like playoffs. Playoffs, if we were playing one opponent, the entire training for that week is based on like countering that opponent. So if you're looking at someone like Dignitas this playoffs that we played, their one strategy that entire season was at 19 minutes, we're going to bring everyone to Baron, and we're going to try to rush it with Callista, Nunu, Cassio, etc. And so your entire draft strategy for that week is based around playing around that strategy and like making sure they don't get champions like that. But normally it would be something along the lines of we have like something that we're working towards that week. The day before we play, we'll have like a hour, maybe half hour to an hour long meeting with like some of the priorities that we were going into. And then the next morning, me and one of the analysts that I work with will go through maybe the most likely scenarios for 2 or 3 hours. And then we'll pick out some of like the really weak ones and we'll discuss them again in a morning meeting later that day. So it'll be maybe like an hour and a half to 2 total that we would talk about each match, at least the players' involvement.
Each match meaning each game in a best of 5, or like several draft scenarios, or each best of 5?
Each like best of.
Okay. Like put it this way. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I think it's pretty similar to us. We just refined drafts throughout the week based on priorities. Not necessarily to counter our opponent already. We just wanted to perfect the meta in terms of drafting. And then the day before our games, we would actually sit down on a whiteboard. And that would go between an hour or 2 hours, depending on the energy of the players. Like some players would just at some point say, Joey, I'm tired, just pick me whatever you want. And for example, Sven and Mitzi, they were really methodical. They wanted to know everything that was going to happen. So they would sit there for 1 or 2 hours just drafting with me for both blue and red side if it was a best of 3 in Europe. And I think at Worlds, you prepare the day before, like 1, maybe 2 hours. But sometimes you have 2 matches in one day or 3 matches in one day. And then you prepare a draft for your first opponent. And then you see your opponent play again. So you might actually make changes. But usually you know your priorities and you know what champions the enemy is very good on. Because every team seems to have these champions that they excel on. So there's less preparation for like second and third games, but you still discuss them right after your game is over. You watch the enemy play, and then you're immediately discussing like, hey, what are we going to ban? What are we going to prioritize? Are we changing anything?
Okay. Because when we talk about like the concept of how well a coach does the draft, like one of the big problems obviously is everyone's coaching a different team. If everyone's coaching the same team, then we'd have a very good sense of who was doing a better job. So I've always felt like the reason it's tough to do the whole Korean versus Western coach is like, well, I've never seen the control group. Like, let's have Koma coach Dignitas next season and see how he does. You know, like I'd, you know, then I'd actually know if he was the best ever. Like, put it this way, if you see the teams that win Worlds, do they have to have very good drafting to do that? What's your sense for it? Like, okay, let me put it this way. If I was a coach, say, I'll give you an example. Say I coached a Brazilian team, right? If people critiqued my drafts and said, oh, but look, Como did it way better, I'd be like, I don't have Faker, do I? I don't have a guy who just can play everything. Like, you know, what's your sense?
I think the teams that advance further in the World Championships have less to do with draft and more to do with the amount of work they put into that year, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think drafting is that important. If you're a better team, you will win most of the times anyway.
Yeah. Because the funny thing is, I mean, I've just got a quick anecdote, Kelsey. But basically, I remember I read a book once about a guy who was like a youth level chess champion. And he actually said that in the chess world, basically, tons of people got obsessed with like subscribing to magazines that would just tell you how to do like the most modern metagame openings, because they obviously realized, kind of like the draft, like the first moves you can make in the game, yeah, if you get a really good start, oh, you feel like, oh, I might win this game, you know. So everyone became so obsessed with that some people just basically put all their practice time and way too much emphasis on that. Yet the whole thing was all the really great players could actually just even overcome a bad start, and they were just the best at the end of the game, you know. It was actually kind of a wasted time, because obviously you should put in some effort, but it's not the be all end all, as a lot of people try to pretend, right?
I think the bigger issue because we're also discussing like the perception between the fans and what happens in coaching, and a lot of that comes with interpreters, and I think a lot of analysts, even on air, discuss their I guess ideas or preconceptions about draft,
Sure.
and they influence the community's perception of it a lot more than I think they would do themselves, if that makes sense. Because there's like some drafts where I think it's fine, it plays to certain strengths, and there'll just be a caster totally flaming the draft for no reason because they don't understand like the specific constraints that each team is like working with.
Yeah.
So I think that's like a big reason that I think draft is focused on a lot, is because the narrative from the casting desk is also focusing on it.
I think draft is when you have a concept of how a game can play out in theory before the game actually plays out. And so it's maybe one of the easier things to analyze, which is why a lot of attention gets focused on it, I think, relative to a lot of other factors in the game when people are on a broadcast analyzing. I also would say that drafting, it's really hard for me to distinguish like, oh, the better team always wins from draft, because I feel like the more you're working and refining what happens and what works for you, the better of a concept you have on like what you can draft and what you're going to play in different scenarios. So I think those go hand in hand. That said, I do think that the closer the skill gap between teams, the more draft will end up mattering. So if you're not to a certain level, it's kind of hard to really hammer home draft. At the same time, I feel like it's impossible to just like focus on something and not focus on draft almost, because the better your understanding of the game is, the better the understanding of your draft is going to be as well.
But I think there's a lot of like misconceptions that go into it. I'll give you an example. I think we were playing summer playoffs last year, right? And this is when like Shen and Vlad were pretty highly prioritized by teams. Okay. And Trundle was a good counter pick into Shen, but it was also flexed into the support position. And then what happened was the first game we went into it, we took Vlad away, and they took Shen and Trundle at the same time because they wanted to block giving us Shen, and also wanted to block us countering Shen. And so as the later the draft went on, our Trundle priority increased because we wanted to have a similar interaction. So in the last game, I ended up picking Vlad and Trundle in the same rotation, and the casters just thought it was super weird, and they thought that Trundle was a super strong support pick. But the idea wasn't that Trundle was a strong support pick. It was, there's like a lot of interactions in draft that go on behind the scene, and they're trying to block different picks. But a lot of these nuances aren't being picked up by casters, so they end up sort of projecting a lot of narratives on draft onto like the fans who also don't understand. And that's why I think the community consensus ends up being super reductionist when the process itself is a lot more complicated.
Sure. Another aspect I want to ask along those lines is, like, this is another part where I've noticed whenever anyone analyzes, like, obviously I'm not that knowledgeable about the game, so I can't say whether they said what champion they said you should have picked was the correct one. But one area that I have noticed what seems like an inconsistency is a lot of people will say something like, oh, you could have picked this at this point, which is a very strong champion, but they don't always say it in the context of the composition. So obviously that's a part that I find bizarre, because I've always been personally someone who generally ascribes to the philosophy that it's better to actually have a plan than to just like wing it. So as a result, if like as I'm making a composition in this hypothetical draft, I lose a couple of things that I would have needed to make this composition, I'm not just going to go, right, well, technically Janna is the best support champion, so I'll just pick it anyway, even if it makes no logical sense. I might have to pick something that is considered objectively weaker, but actually fits into the overall, like I have a win condition when I pick this lesser champion, right? And that's kind of nuanced, but it's got to be a factor, right?
Do you want to take this one? Or?
Yeah,
everyone's too polite here. Just jump in.
I think it is. I mean, there's a difference between. So in the early stages, you usually do pick what's meta, but especially in the second phase of draft nowadays, you see a lot of picks that might be subpar, but just fit a team comp really well or accentuate the strength of one lane. For example, if you have a very strong bot lane in your first 3 picks, you might play a Talia or a Galio, even if they're not meta, which they were at Worlds. But if they're not, you can just play these champions and completely control the bot side jungle and just play for a bot lane tower.
Yeah, sure. I think that there is a tendency to look at drafts either based, like I haven't ever really seen a good mix of people looking at drafts wholly compositionally or just based on lane? Like people either reductionistly criticized drafts based on this lane wins, this lane wins, this lane wins, or they'll be really reductionist and not necessarily care about lane matchups and say, oh, but at 20 minutes they can go for Baron with this setup, even if at that point they'll be super behind and it's hard to get Baron vision, or the enemy team has a Malzahar or something like this. So I think it's really difficult to, and also it's really hard to analyze a draft like in isolation without looking at the enemy team as well.
And I think we talked about this briefly, Thorin.
Yes.
You said that why don't I just, like, if there are misconceptions, why don't coaches just come out and say it?
Oh, he's revealed himself as a source for a potential video I might have made. Okay, right.
Yeah, but I mean, the entire premise was that you can't really, like, coaches after a game, especially if it's lost, I don't think any like self-respecting coach will go out and say, this draft was fine, my players just played badly, because you're literally diverting all of the blame onto like the play, which is
tempting though, isn't it? It's fucking tempting sometimes.
Which is the opposite of what you want to do. So, and that, and plus, like during the season, if you're like, oh no, this is not why, this is our priorities, then you're also giving up a lot away. And one like notable example is like, I think last year Immortals, they were like super frustrated with the way they were drafting, because they were drafting like Nidalee and Karma in the bot lane and ended up having no CCs. So like Pobelter just like frustrated in an interview, just told Travis this. And the next set, I was just like, okay, I know they're not going to take Sivir and Karma together because they want CC from bot lane for some reason. And we ended up winning those games solely because of what Pobelter said, like in an offhand in frustration, which is why like...
I mean, the most classic example ever, obviously, and Youngbuck will know this because it was his old teammate Amazing when he did that AMA, or whatever it was, just before he came to NA. Like, these are my 3 champions I play, and then Cloud9 just banned all 3 matter. That's obviously the most ridiculous example. It's going to happen very rarely, but there is a level of that, right? You don't want to give up any insight. Not because the thing is, yes, the fan would get it, but if that other coach is reading it, you don't want him to get a little clue as to why you didn't pick something right.
I mean, of course, we have the recent Power of Evil example of how self-defense can really easily turn into a complete and utter disaster anyway.
Turn into self-harm, yes.
So sometimes it's better just not to say anything.
I think whether it's your own fault or sometimes it's your player's fault, but if it's your own fault, it has no use to defend yourself if you've lost. If it's your player fault, you have to protect him. Like maybe your player said, I can win this matchup if I get this champion. And then you give him the champion and he completely gets tomed or just doesn't play towards his win condition. And then people will say, yeah, the draft sucked because this lane was feeding or didn't or got run over. And I'm thinking, yeah, well, you're right, but that's it. You know, I'll take the blame. It's much better than the player getting the blame.
I wonder how often you manage that though, because I'm getting curious now. I'm going to go back through every old interview of Parth. I'm going to see, like, if there's games where he's like, that's on me, you know, I did it bad. The games where he doesn't say that, basically those are the ones where Bjergsen picked the champion. Like, you know, he was like, no, don't pick it. No, I want Orianna. Okay. I'm sick on it, bro. I'm sick.
How much?
There's maybe 5 interviews you'll have to go through in the last 2 years.
It's true. That is the ultimate move. Like, you just don't do interviews, then you can't give anything away. Exactly. The old top of the head.
How much responsibility do you take for situations that aren't draft based? Like, for example, say a player says that, I can really win this matchup, and then in theory you've gone over the matchup with the player or something of that nature, and then the player just plays poorly. Do you then talk in your head, internalize it like, well, I should have understood the circumstances on the day better? Or do you also take responsibility for it by saying, okay, well, I should have taught this better in terms of how the team composite from was going to go out? Like, is it reasonable for the community to blame you for that as well?
Well, I think that's where at some point the Western culture needs to get to is the coach should be responsible for not only just drafting the picks on stage, but also making sure that the players know how to play the champions that you're drafting them. For example, the draft we did in the last game, which was like the Jay Sejuani, it's a very strong 2v2, and maybe it was like a workable draft. Maybe it was something that we could have won with, but it is still a bad draft if you as a coach weren't able to teach them like the basic concepts to make that draft work. So overall, regardless of what happens with like draft, the responsibility, I think, at some point is still going to come back to the coaches, especially the later the season goes on.
Okay. So another principle I wanted to talk about, which I as far as I know is definitely different between East and West, is like, as far as I'm aware, not many coaches in the West have any kind of direct input into who joins a team. Like, they might be able to give their opinion on a few players off, or maybe they can hint to the team owner, I'd like to play, have this player. But it's not like they pick the player and then therefore they kind of vouch for this guy, and also, but then get the control and the responsibility of like, right, I'm going to use him in this way. He's going to be used this sense. What do you think on that topic?
I mean, the most hilarious example has been the G2 announcement that just came out, which was like looking for a head coach to help decide on roster, and it's like, okay, guys, nice try.
It's a good bait though. I like it.
I think it goes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Parth. You want to start, mate?
I think, at least in NA, they've been doing this a lot more than EU. Is finally the concept of, you want, like, as a coach, you want buy-in from the org to do your job properly. Yes. And then ideally you also want to build a roster that you can work with. And that's something I think Tony from CLG has done really well. And then it's a thing that Immortals tried like last year in 2016, where they brought on Dylan and Robert as like their two-man coaching team. And then they used them to build the roster. So a lot of the roster is built to like the way they wanted the structure to work. And it's similar with Tony. Tony's pretty outspoken. Like, their org's philosophy is like they want players who exhibit good teamwork, and they think that philosophically, if you like, teamwork is better than like mechanically strong players. And so Tony's like has a lot of say in what roster, like what players he can build, bring onto the team, and who he can work with. But then there's also like the secondary side, where a lot of the coaches in the West, I don't think, are as well-rounded as a lot of the Korean coaches. And so you can't really, as an org, go out and be like, I'm going to get the superstar coach, and then he's going to help me with all facets of how to help like build this roster. Okay. So I do think the second half of that is every roster is going to need something different. And so, like, say you have players like Mithy on G2. He has super high game knowledge from what I know. And so you need, like, I don't necessarily think you need a coach who has super high game knowledge. Someone who works with, like, structure and health is much better. Whereas teams who have players like Forgiven, who are super, like, highly talented, but are super emotional in the way they work with their team members, maybe having a coach with more authority or who can deal with a lot of mental issues. So I think right now, since Western orgs or just in the West, they don't have well-rounded coaches yet, it's been more of a collaboration of how to take like the roster you have and put the coach in place that best fits that roster. And those are the orgs that have been more successful than not.
Okay.
I do think that organizations will always put their trust and the power in the people that are most important to them and worth the most. So from my own experience, when I came to G2, I didn't have much trust. I didn't have much power at all. And so halfway through MSI, I'm being told, hey, Joey, by the way, we're signing a new bot lane. So I was completely out of that conversation, right? Because I was just new and not as trusted as much. But then at the end of the year, after Worlds, I had a lot more say about the roster, and Carlos was actually asking me a lot about the roster. Like, Expect was discussed, and I was heavily pushing to keep him because I knew that he would be a good top laner for us. And so I think you have to, as a coach, gain trust, whether it's from your own organization or from the community. You need to build an actual reputation that you are good at your job before people are actually going to trust you and have organizations make you think you're worth more than just a player, a star player.
Okay.
Can I ask you, Youngbuck, because you've been one of the more vocal coaches about how much you've sort of learned over the process of coaching, and starting out, you were a bit more managerial, but your responsibilities and stuff increased. Like, how do you go about earning that trust, like, as you grow and as you're willing to take on more stuff? Because I feel like this is a bit of a challenge, because if you're hired for one thing and then your abilities to handle more stuff will improve, like, inevitably, if you're working really hard. So how do you take on more and more over time?
I think the way I earned the trust was by Carlos talking to players and asking for feedback. I am pretty certain that when he resigned us halfway through 2016, he resigned us right after having a one-on-one with Sven and Mithy, because they didn't have the greatest past with other coaches, so they wanted to make sure that they had a coach they were happy with. And so I knew Carlos was waiting. I told him before, hey, I'm not going to sign for less than this. And he was like, I told him, take your time. If you don't want to do it, it's fine. And then after a few weeks, I know we talked to Sven and Mitty, and then the next day was like, hey, Joey, by the way, let's do this. Let's sign for 2017. So in my case, it was definitely through feedback from the players to the manager, the owner. And of course, the results themselves also spoke for themselves because we had 5 rookies and 1 the split.
Okay. Well, in that case, when you said that you kind of had direct input into the expect move or like asking to keep him, that's something I wanted to ask about them, because that's something that from the outside is so difficult to gauge, which is that teams like TSM and G2, which are obviously winning domestically, to a degree, are the ultimate destinations for the people within those regions. Like most players, I mean, as we actually saw with the G2 bot lane, will hop to the next best team if that's the team that's beating them, or if they've got a good offer, and assuming the team has the money, obviously. So a lot of fans or outsiders will think, why not upgrade? Why not try and get a player who's considered the best top laner? Or, for example, in your case, if you want someone who's going to play tanks, you get the best tank player in Europe or whatever to be the G2 top laner. So in both of your teams, you've had some players where they weren't necessarily considered the best, but presumably you have some philosophy behind keeping them. So how do you kind of gauge whether or not to keep a player who might not be the best at his position, but what goes into that kind of process?
Right. So for Expect, I knew he was, in my opinion, the best top laner in Europe at the time. He was doing incredibly well in scrims against European top laners, and he just had some issues on stage, even though I still think he played fairly fine. And I also knew that he had a really good personality, worked very hard, and was very open to feedback. So he was one of the players that was learning the most. And I had trust in him that if he had stayed with us for another couple of months and we made some changes to assist him, because he was a really great teammate, but he was a little bit like lazy and waking up in time and being more strict and disciplined. So I knew I needed to help him with that. And I then trusted that if we did that and if he learned a little bit more English, he would be the best top laner in Europe. Which I think he is. I think he's one of the most underestimated players right now in the West. So I think the investment was worth it, even though a lot of people in the community don't really rate him very high when they see him, because he's just that tank player or the guy that plays for a team. But I personally think he's the best top laner in the West right now, even though SOAS had a better regular split than him.
So, I mean, even, I guess, ignoring the expect point to an extent, well, still riffing off of that, but I think a lot of coaches tend to have maybe some bias for players that they played with a lot. To what extent do you think that that actually makes the relationship with the coaching thing better? Like, you can work better with this player because you're more used to them, versus just at what point do you think you need to try to work with someone else, or there's a better player out there who might suit your team better, but you don't have the same kind of relationship, so you're not completely sure?
I think it depends on how you want to run the team. For example, if Expect wasn't open to feedback, we probably would have looked for someone else. At the time, we actually did discuss another option. I won't go into detail of who, but it was basically very simple. Expect was long-term, probably going to be better. This guy's probably going to be better for the short-term. What do we want to do? How are the attitudes of the players? How are they going to grow into the team? And then we said, okay, well, Expect might be a little bit of a gamble, but we believe that in the long-term, he will work out, so we're going to go for him.
Okay. One of the reasons why I brought up the more abstract topic before of should a coach have control over the team, etc. In general, obviously, in a lot of sports, that is a key factor. But even in professional sports, there are the coaches who it's a job. They get brought in, they get to go to the best team they can find, and then here's the players, and then a lot of them have to then make that tough choice. And there's no right answer here, but they have to go, right, do I either bring in my own philosophy, this is how I think the game should be played, this is how I want to construct the team, and now I have to figure out which pieces I can sometimes, I might have to force this one a little bit, this person will probably fit me there, and I'll figure out the mix as I go. Or do I be very cynical and just say, these are the pieces I've got, what can I build out of it? Do you come in with the idea, do you reverse engineer it from the roster? What's your philosophy on that? Come on, Parth. You didn't pick the team, so you can tell me, mate.
Oh, sure. I mean, I'm one of the few coaches who's worked with the least players overall. But I can tell you a little bit more about how we came up with the trade last summer. So Bora left, I think, at the end of spring split, and we were in a mad scramble to look for support. So that's when we flew to Korea and then we brought Biofrost along with us just to scrim with us, and he was going to be part of the tryout process, but we were looking at more higher profile players like Ignar, and I think we had Hybrid fly out for a few days.
Yes.
And it's like Youngbuck said, it came down to a lot more high profile, or not high profile, it came down to more who fits the team, not only in playstyle, but how easy it is to work with that player. And Vincent was like, he was a lot more receptive than Hybrid and had like a bigger champion pool, even though he was a rookie. And then the other part was also, even though Ignar was much better than Vincent at the time, we saw a lot more potential in Vincent just because of he clicked a lot more with the players that were there. And that's simply partly because he spoke English and Ignar did not. And that's why, like, I think that's, like, even before that split, I think me and Andy had decided that the game is going towards a lot more teamwork-based game, and communication is going to be one of the most important things. And that's one of the biggest reasons why we haven't really gone after a lot of Korean-speaking players, because it's not just how good of a player you are, but also how you fit in with the team that you're going to be on, both culturally and what piece you bring to the team. And I think a lot of teams have made those risks, and some of them have paid off and some of them haven't. And it's just hard for you as someone who's building a team to judge if you bring X player on who does not speak English, if he's going to be successful in your environment or not.
Sure.
So, like, I'm curious, like, how it was at G2. Like, you guys had 2 Koreans on your team. How did you integrate them? Because I think it's incredibly hard what you guys did.
Yeah, if you look at the outside, it sounds really hard, but I think we just clicked very well personality-wise, all the players together, and it was maybe a luck of the draw. We had very good players, but also just everyone was buying into the same culture. Everyone had the same goals and missions, so it was very easy for us to work together. And we also had Koreans who were very willing to learn English. So I don't think we ever had problems just because of that. We had the same goals from the start. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. I think maybe we just got lucky. But I hear a lot of horror stories about other teams with Koreans that maybe don't speak English very well, don't know how to express themselves, don't work well with the team, don't know how to communicate in-game, but we never really had those problems.
But it's not like I don't think it's their fault, right? Like, sometimes you just come over and you become homesick, or sometimes you just can't find someone else who speaks Korean with you. And there's a lot of issues that you just can't foresee when you bring players like that on.
That's true. And that's why I personally thought that more teams were going to go for full English-speaking teams, or at least teams having players from the same culture. But I guess I was wrong looking at the roster that are being built right now. I think Europe is cutting down a little bit on the Korean players, but America still seems to be going full in on the Koreans. But I think that's a wrong decision, especially if you're a franchise team who can go for a long-term result.
So obviously there were these eras, I mean, where teams have done very well who've had Koreans, but like, as a general principle, I feel like a lot of people have started to move back to the philosophy that if you can, it's obviously better to have the as you said, not even just cultural, like, symmetry basically in the squad, because obviously not just literal communication, but even how they think of the game and how you'll teach people and what teams they've played in the past. You kind of just get to shortcut some of that, hopefully, if you have them all for one region, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it has to do with. I don't think it has to, like, someone being Korean is like a very dramatic example of, oh, there's like a clear difference between the way you like think and can communicate. There's even teams right now that have players that have like very diametric views on how they want to proceed. Like, there's teams where like one player is in there just because he's like, his goal is to be a pro player and like make his career as long as possible, but not burn out. And he believes in something like things like work-life balance, and he wants to have like a break after they finish scrims. Whereas there will be other players in that team who like grind 24/7, and that sort of culture is also something that needs to be resolved before like a roster is built, because those end up like leading to conflicts like between teams, between players and staff, and a lot of those are like the sorts of the intangibles of why some players and teams end up not working long term, is because not only are they drafted for they're drafted just because, oh, this is the best player that I can find for the spot.
Yes.
But there's no cohesion in there from like the org or the coaching staff side in terms of like what's expected out of everyone from a cultural basis.
And again, I think it's a lot easier to do that if the players are maybe coming from your region or a region that speaks your same language, because they're easier to talk to. They're easy to see them already interacting in solo queue.
I just wanted to say that it's not like impossible for someone from Korea to go to Europe and like find success. Like Huni and Rainover is like a classic example of like there are players that can do that. It's just incredibly hard for you to scout and find those players.
Well, I mean, I think Kelsey can obviously give a good point on this, because obviously the most ridiculous one is the Koreans who go to China and don't even have a common language when they get there. Yeah, obviously some of them, Team WE got top 4 worlds. So you've given your thoughts on that a lot of times, Kelsey, but do you have a general kind of something you can distill it down to?
And yeah, I think it's about over the course of the split, you already have to do so many things to get the team to be on the same page, to understand macro, to go from point A to point B, to come up to an understanding of how you're going to play this, this, and this. Like, how are you going to work together to learn and understand this type of thing? So if you're adding like extra stuff that you kind of have to resolve, to an extent, it just makes things a lot harder, enough hours in the day. And when sometimes I think a lot of the Chinese teams, especially naively, thought that they wouldn't even have to deal with facilitating this, so they just didn't bother, right? They just like grabbed the highest profile Korean players and were like, carry us. Oh, what do you mean you're not used to playing like bot-centric meta? What is this? I don't. So I think that's like it's not like the Korean player's fault. It's not like the other player's fault, but it's just, I think a lot of teams just will go more smoothly the more conflicts you can minimize. And that also goes for like a lot of all Chinese rosters have just like hated each other and fought internally constantly, and those don't work anyway either. So,
because I actually do think, yeah, come on.
Sorry, go ahead. I mean, I was going to take it on to a different tangent. So
let's do it. Yeah, don't worry. I was going somewhere else anyway. Come on.
Okay, because the things you guys are talking about right now is like how much input do coaches have in terms of like roster building, right?
Yes.
The other thing is also how coaching staffs are built, and it's like a very similar issue, because we had 10 NA teams last year, and each of them had like a very distinct coaching like staff and style, whereas I think in Korea it's like a lot more standardized. Like the hierarchy is there, like the progression is there, whereas everyone in the West is still trying to figure out how to run the best staff with within each org. Mm-hmm.
And obviously in Korea, sometimes they might be together for like 3 years, 4 years, 5, they have a lot that might keep the staff together a long time.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I think Immortals this year, I think after Dylan left, I think their performance coach was their head coach, and then they brought in Song. I think TL had they had D-Lim, Saint for a little while. They brought in Jarge, and then I think then later they brought on like Kane from C9. CLG has Tony, and that's been like the one solid person the entire time. Envy hired like the ex-StarCraft dude, and then and like every team has like their own like staff that are trying to like put in and work with, and I don't think the orgs know what works and what doesn't, and that's like a huge thing, I think.
Can I ask you, you said you think that Korean systems are more standardized and stuff. Like, what kind of research have you done into what Korean coaching staffs and stuff are like?
They're very anecdotal. I mean, they mostly come from like talking to Loco and Lustboy.
Okay. I mean, she's not dissing you by saying that, by the way. Put fucking Bug in their house and get them drunk and give them like the drugs like they had in the Cold War to make them spill the beans. You have to go by anecdotes, right? That's all you've got.
Yeah. But I mean, generally, it's like you don't like just in the West. There's like examples of like, oh, by the way, you are now like the head coach of this team, and just like, what experience do you have? What have you done in the past? Whereas in Korea, it's like you don't just get to that level. You are first an analyst, you grind it out, then you maybe become an assistant coach, and then eventually you may be promoted to head coach, and you'll like go to like a different team and then become a head coach of that team. But I think in the West, you just have like a random smorgasbord of, oh, this guy is now a head coach, and I guess this guy is now being promoted to assistant coach despite having never worked in esports. Oh, this guy's being brought on as like the head coach, but he has no game knowledge, but he has a lot of experience in like other games. There's no like standard for it, and I think that's. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, and I think part of that is like an asymmetry of information coming from Korea and also from sports, and people deciding like what's more valuable, because some people will try to copy like a generic basketball sports structure or with position coaches and stuff like this, or some people will try to copy whatever their perception based on limited anecdotal evidence from Loco Doco or whoever of what a Korean system is like. So I think that that's seeing a bunch of different stuff from.
Yeah, but I mean, that's like the thing, right? Like people say that, oh, as an infrastructure, we've caught up with what like the West is caught up and we know what we're doing. Here's a head coach for every team. Here's an assistant coach for every team. But I think it's still a long ways away. And like the biggest thing that's going to come with, the biggest thing that's going to influence that is just time. At some point, like pros are going to retire and some of them are going to go into coaching. New players are going to be a lot more receptive to coaching because they're going to have a lot of less experience than the coaches who've been there. I think orgs will just be more comfortable or have like a better idea of what kind of structures that they want to work with. But I don't think it's close to there yet.
Sure.
One thing that... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I also think it's a lot about the natural evolution of coaching because Korea has had coaches for over a decade now, I think, and a lot of the coaches right now in the LCK have also had experience in StarCraft or maybe other games. Mm-hmm. So naturally, they've had that grind maybe 10 years ago already, whereas coaching in the West is maybe 3 years old now. So there are very little results to base off of who are good coaches. And then there's also a lot of teams that just hire friends or people they hear something good about from this one particular person and don't really necessarily get the results of the actual coach.
Yes. Well, one of the weirdest things I was thinking about actually is that, okay, so if I ask a bunch of people on Reddit, who are the best Korean coaches, right? Obviously, everyone's going to say Koma. The list gets fucking short after that. They don't even know the names of the other coaches. And in fact, what's mad is in Korea, it seems like coaches are never even a topic. Like, you never hear of like, oh, there's this amazing coach who's on like the 5th best team and he's so good, but you know, he doesn't have the players. That story doesn't exist. They're just like, whoever's winning must be the best. Whoever's losing, they must suck. And then in LPL, I mean, you can elucidate on this, Chelsea, but it's even more ridiculous because, for example, I remember in LPL when that fucking Firefox guy won with LGD and everyone was like, he's fucking shit. It's like, he just won the split. And then obviously since then has now reversed the whole rep about him. So the other regions seem even more bizarre than the West in a way.
I think the LPL is even more confusing because the elements of how the staff is set up in the LPL is not at all that comparable, and there are a lot of cultural reasons for it. Like on the surface, a lot of stuff looks similar. You have a head coach, you have analysts, you have assistant coaches, but the amount that the org interferes changes drastically. The amount of power that's given to players themselves, I think, is even more extreme than it is in the West, where a lot of Western teams, obviously, there's still a lot of power invested in the players. So I think it's really difficult to say exactly how good certain LPL coaches are. I think that you can still hear word of mouth stuff, but it's just like, obviously you can apply this everywhere, but there's no definitive way from the outside, I think, to tell who is a good coach. Yes. Like, I hear good things anecdotally about both Youngbuck and Parth, but I can't definitely know if they're good or not, right?
Sure. So, well, I will say this. Here's probably like a slightly counterintuitive concept that you've probably never thought of that's actually makes the West better in coaching than Korea, is that as you said, a lot of the coaches in Korea, like they might have worked for the StarCraft team of Samsung. Well, that's not a great example because that one didn't really have the same squad. But they might have worked for SK Telecom or something like that, and they might be able to transition from game to game. You notice they don't just go, oh, Koma this season's the KT Rolster coach. So that's one thing that, while it's also a negative that in the West, you just get a team and then you might have one split. If you're in Korea, like, good luck if you were the CJ Entus coach, because as soon as that team didn't have any good players anymore, your career is just down the pipes and you're just there forever. You're just stuck in that prison, mate. There's no transfer market for coaches in Korea. It's an org. So there's actually an up and a downside to it. Just no one ever thinks of the downside, bizarrely. I mean, it's all great. It's all well and good if you're on TSM path, but it's not that great if you're the fucking Renegades coach for 10 years. Obviously, joke there because there could never have been 10 years of Renegades. It's environment. We all know that. So, look on the bright side.
Wait, you're saying coaching in Korea is better because the coaches have a lot more...
It's better and worse. It's better in as much as you might get to work with all the players. Say you're an SK Telecom coach. Maybe you can be the coach for 5 years. That's good if you're SK Telecom. If you are Afrika Freaks, probably not as cool to have to be the coach or only Afrika Freaks for 5 years with no opportunity to become the coach of SK Telecom, You see what I mean? There's actually a downside I don't think anyone ever thinks of.
I guess. I'm just thinking of in context of the performance of like the teams at an international level, more so than the well-being of the coaches in the ecosystem. So I guess.
Yes.
I mean,
someone's got to think about the coach's path. Come on, it's not just about the teams and the regions. I just care about those guys that with the clipboard.
There is a way out. You do so terribly on Afrika Freaks.
I'm glad that was where it was going. I thought it was like suicide you were implying there. Fucking hell, yeah, there is a way out. Okay, so the way out is you sabotage the team. Okay.
You sabotage the team so that they're terrible. Then you get picked up by a Chinese or Western team because you're Korean, and you rebuild it, and then you potentially get hired, by the top Korean orgs.
Isn't that sort of like what Yamato Cannon did? But he didn't get hired for being Korean. He just got hired for having swag, wasn't it? just me. Okay, well, tough crowd. Okay, much love to you, Mark Cannon. By the way, some of these are jokes, believe it or not. I have said that before. Okay, so here's another question I have though that I actually feel like is purely League specific. It doesn't apply to any other esports game I'm aware of. Is that because League literally changes the entire meta, sometimes month to month, sometimes within 6 months, definitely year to year. There's never been a meta that just stayed 2 years long. It must be incredibly difficult to be a coach in that world, because even, let's say, a lot of the abstract things we talked about before, let's say, for example, right, Reginald had come to you, Parth, and he said, you're going to not only be the coach, but you're going to be like the GM as well. So pick the players you want for the lineup. Okay, you pick the players you want. Now practice in any way you want. In theory, metas could still come along. Things in the game could still change that mean that you made all these great decisions that now aren't as good. Like, for example, every now and then we have a harsh meta switch, like no more lane swaps, something ridiculous like that. It makes it rough, right? You're kind of having to become a different coach every few months.
I think so, but I think the game has gone on long enough that that's like an expectation. Like, you can't just draft, like you don't draft one trick, so you don't draft just carry player or tank players. All the players that you're drafting are more well-rounded. And I think that even though there have been a lot of like metas that have come about in the last 3 years, I think there is like a general pattern to that. So
there's still fundamentals that can apply.
That transcend like and go like throughout. So I think the basics and fundamentals of the game for the most part stay fairly similar. The only thing that changes is like the value system of like, oh, the jungle has now changed. They have catch-up experience, so they can do X and Y in the early game. Or, oh, now there's a Rift Herald, so you have to play something slightly differently in this game. Or, oh, the Elder Drake now has these buffs, so late game is slightly different. But I think the general way that you play the game, or like the fundamental backbone, has stayed pretty similar. So I definitely think that if you know that as a coach, and the rest just comes down to adaptation, which just comes with working with players, and you just have to like actively figure it out as a squad. It's not like a coach is responsible for like, all right, the game has changed. I am now in charge of figuring out everything that is right with this game, and then telling the players what to do. You have like 5 or 6 or 7, however many players you have on their roster to play the game and give you feedback. And that's how I think most systems work. It's just like adaptation is not all on the coach. I think it's almost the reverse. A lot of the adaptation comes from the feedback from the players.
Okay.
What do you think?
Youngbuck?
No, I agree. I think that as the game evolves, you learn together as a team with the coaching staff. It's not usually coaching staff with the knowledge. So if you're equal in knowledge and then something new happens, so for example, this year we had this big tempo thing. Like priority was always there, but now we recoined it to tempo, and suddenly the entire game is played around it. So we as a team had to figure out everything in regards to playing towards the tempo. And so if I were to coach a new team right now that didn't really play well around it, then I would have to teach them up until that point, and then we're going to start having to figure out all the next layers together again. Because I think players usually figure out the new way of playing the game before a coach does.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like our approach to the game was, we looked at every phase of the game in terms of like 3 major steps, which is like how are you setting up? There's an execution phase, and then after whatever execution happens, there's a reset phase. And those concepts can be applied to every part of the game, regardless of like what meta it is in, because those are more general concepts of how you think about playing the game itself.
So there are a few, I guess, philosophies on this that I've heard in terms of when you're teaching players, like, I guess, these phases. Do you have kind of a static look at what these phases look like that you're teaching, or are you trying to teach them like a dynamic approach to the game where it's like this feeds into this feeds into this, or like what affects this type of setup or decision making?
I mean, that's what it's definitely dynamic. There's no way that can be static. Nothing in League or discussion about League is going to be static. And it's just, it comes down to most reviews. Like, if you can explain the situations that happen in game in the context of those three phases, then it is easier for the players to remember and recognize like what they need to do next. Like, say you're doing like a tower dive in the early game, there's like a setup that's required for it, and then after you take it, there's like a reset in terms of like what you want to do after. And then it's the same thing as like, if you end up taking Baron, both are like two diametrically different parts of the game, but you can apply like the same concept to it. So if you teach and help them do reviews in the context of those phases, a lot of those things are like easy to remember and replicate. Okay. But obviously it's not static.
Okay. What are the challenges with coaching superstar players? Both people have superstar players, so feel free to. I know they're all waiting. Like, just one or two.
I'll let you take this one first.
Nah, I'm gonna no comment this.
It's that hard. See, that's all you need to know. They don't even know where to begin, because even when they're not on the same teams, that superstar player will just instantly message them the second this episode comes out. What the fuck you say about me? In Croatian. Actually, it's a Serbian language, but they can call it Croatian all they want. But, you know. Anyway, yeah, go ahead, Parth.
Why did you have no comment? I'm actually curious first.
Because he's had all the egos, hasn't he? Come on. He's got the Wonder Boys. He's got the old flamers in mid lane.
I'm not overlooking something before responding.
He's got a guy who played on 120 ping from satellite connection. That's why he loves Expect. Expect just shuts the fuck up and plays a tank. He's a perfect player.
I would no comment it because I have very little negative things to say about my star players. And the negative things I do have to say are not for the public.
Okay. But what about then as a more abstract concept? Like, do you have to treat the star player, especially if there's someone who thinks of themselves as I'm like the best player or I'm the focal point? Do you have to? Is there like a component where with them it's not teaching them the game, it's like working on mentality or something, or do you have to keep people's egos in check? What do you think as a more abstract concept?
I mean, you shouldn't have to treat them differently, but a lot of that is also up to the organization if they cater towards the coach or to the star player, and that's different for each organization.
Indeed. So another organization is TSM.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll answer this question, and it was pretty straightforward for me. I think Bjergsen is like the most responsible player on that team, and I never had any issues because any issues that I would have, he was. How do I phrase this?
He preempted some of the issues that would have been a problem anyway, or he was
on the same
page as you?
It's like I would never have any issues with him, and there's like, I think Kevin and Peter both also looked up to him, so I never ended up having issues because he was like the example set for them to follow in a lot of ways.
Okay. Just yet more feeding into the narrative of the perfect one, the chosen one, Bjergsen, the boy that lived. Okay.
I mean, yeah, I don't really like to feed into narratives, but it's a fact. So
it's a pretty cool narrative, though. It's pretty sick. That's why I liked it when Doublelift said that comment in that interview where he said that he's the protagonist of the LCS. You're not, are you, though, mate? Like, it's clearly Bjergsen. Just know he rolled, Doublelift. That's all I'm going to say, mate. You're really good at hitting people with auto attacks after 22 minutes, but you know the other guy kind of is the protagonist. Has been in all the LCS finals, you know.
I mean, good. I'm not saying he's a protagonist. It's just, let's say you have 3 star players on your team, and one of them is. Like Bjergsen, for example, he's the one if like the team is having issues, and he's the one who will actually step forward and like he'll reach out to Dennis and say, I watched this VOD. This is what I think we should be doing next game. Or he's the one who every time like a few players want to go out and eat food, he'll be like, yeah, but I can really get like a few more solo queue games in. And so a lot of the issues that you can see like star players having in terms of attitude, work ethic, reacting to like reviews and interactions with coaching staff, he just sets an example that it's easy for the other players. Like it was easy for me not having problems with the other players as much.
Some coaches have kind of said that it's nice to have, not necessarily saying that your relationship with Bjergsen is like this, but to have like a player that the other players look up to who will kind of back you up in situations that's like, oh, okay, well, this rookie hotshot doesn't want to do what Coach Parth says, but Bjergsen says that I should. And then it eventually like creates this idea of, well, he's backing him up, so I should just listen to the coach over time.
I mean, yeah, obviously, if you are having like an issue and there's like 2 or 3 people who like give you examples for why you shouldn't or should do something, it's a lot more powerful than just like you arguing with the coach or you arguing with one player. I do think like most teams have relationships with like players and coaches that are similar. Like I'm sure Youngbuck, you had like similar cases on your team too.
Yeah. And for us, we had Mithy who always came to the players. He was like your star player. Well, when there was an issue between 2 players in game, he would usually study the VOD and be the guy saying, "Hey, I just watched this VOD, and maybe you should have done this and that." So nice to see the parallel now with Bjergsen.
Okay, I've got a question that relates to Koreans, because obviously this is a way you can kind of speculate or try and like deductively guess what they might do with their style. So when you go to Korea for all these Korean boot camps, most famously before Worlds, obviously, or when you have the miniature scrims that you get to have before an MSI or something along these lines. So everyone's been involved in these. When these take place, right, the implication from a lot of interviews I've seen is that the Korean teams like sometimes like try to fuck with the Western teams, and like somehow there's always the story of the one Western team that's like, but we had a 75% scrim record, and then in the games it's like we got wrecked, and they're like, yeah, but they didn't pick the stuff. You know, what's your take on that whole thing? Like, do they have a totally different way of how they practice and what they do in the actual worlds or whatever if you play them?
I mean, I don't particularly think they're trying to screw with us. I mean, each team has a different philosophy of how they approach practice, right? And at least I can tell you this now because I won't be coaching and it'll be a new philosophy. It's because every time we approach scrims, we usually gave the enemy team what they were good at, because in theory, you're not like trying to win or anything. You just want to practice against a specific thing. So say we're practicing against C9, I'd be giving Jensen a lot of the strong picks, and then we'll be trying to figure out a lot of either the mid matchups or like how to get bot river, because they always had like this one style where their support would roam up to mid, and the way they set up with bot working with mid was really good. If we practiced against Dignitas, we'd be, okay, after 20 minutes, we're going to practice how to fight and retake river against their Baron control. And so I think it's similar with Korean teams and what they do to us, and maybe that's what you've heard, where Korean teams give you what like the Western teams are strong at, and that's maybe why Western teams have higher win percentage in scrims against Korean teams than like they do on stage.
Basically, the same principle exists in, as far as I know, all Korean games where they're really big. So I know it was the case in StarCraft 2, and I know actually currently it's the case in Overwatch when they had those tournaments there, that a lot of the Western teams and players said, say you on day one of you arriving in Korea, you know, you get settled and you're playing at like a good level, and you play a few games and you're thinking, hey, this is all right, you know, I'm competing with these guys. They said that basically the more you practiced against the other top Korean people, it felt like they were just trying to figure you out, which is a little bit cynical as opposed to just trying to get better and scrim, you know, like sometimes they were trying to sort of brain drain what you guys would do, and then when they went into the real game, sometimes sometimes they succeeded and they just found the perfect shit out that you're like, oh fuck, that's what they were doing, you know.
But I don't think their goal is to figure you out. Like, I don't think when we scrimmed teams this year, we were trying to figure them out. We were trying to, it was a lot more introspective. Like, like we weren't like, so there was like an entire day of scrims against Longzhu where we just gave them Callista every game, because we were just like, this is a really strong champions. We just need to decide if it is worth permabanning like everyone else is doing, or we can actually play against it. And we're like, all right, Longzhu's bot lane, really strong. Let's see what they can do with it. And so it's not like we were like trying to give them secret picks and see how they played. It was a lot more introspective. And I think that's the same for Korean teams too. I don't think they're like malicious or they're trying to like figure Western teams out. They're trying to do the best with the scrim partners that they have to figure out like their own, like whatever they want to figure out themselves.
Okay. What do you think, Youngbuck?
I do think that Korean teams try to figure out the other teams, but I think that's a mutual thing because usually you leave everything open and you basically say, throw everything you've got at me. And the Koreans can do that. And for example, when we played against Korean teams, we had a lot of pressure to play good because we wanted to continue scrimming them. So we would draft very seriously, and players feel like this great need to prove themselves to the Korean teams. So we would play very serious, and then you go out of scrims and you're like, wow, guys, we went 6-6 against Longzhu. We were really good. We're going to scrim them more. And then we actually scrimmed them, I think the second week of Worlds, and I think they 8-0'd us in about 5 hours. So
all right, then.
They stopped trying to figure out the meta, figure out what we play, and they just play their own style, and it's completely demolished us, which was very demoralizing. But I do think it's the right approach, and I just think a lot of teams, when they play the Korean teams, they play very serious, while they're actually just letting the Korean teams letting the other teams throw everything they have at them, see if they can beat them with it, so they can incorporate it in their own game style.
So is that still a thing then, that principle, that when you first get there, if you do really badly against Korean teams, like they just, maybe they don't explicitly tell you like fuck off, but they just stop booking scrims against you because they think you're not good?
I think it depends on the teams.
Yeah, I mean, we gave up on that. We don't, like this year, that's one of the few things that we learned from last year, which is why, like our experience with Korean Bootcamp last year was like, there was like the whole hack where our scrims were leaked and we had like a lot of issues with, we wanted to try hard and prove ourselves against Korean teams. But this year, this was nothing like that. We were equally willing to like lose scrims to Korean teams. And we like didn't have we never thought that, if we sack these scrims and because we wanted to learn, they won't scrim us again. Because that was never like a factor in how we played.
I actually like the story you gave there, Youngbuck, though, of if they were winning too much, then they just started like styling on you. Because that's obviously another area where when you think of this perfect image people have of Koreans, like, they're so serious and professional. Like I remember actually Mithy had his story like that, where from season 3 Worlds, even though everyone remembers that Samsung Ozone team did terribly, actually in scrims, supposedly, because Lemon Dogs was in the other groups, they were scrimming them at this Worlds. Mithy said by the end, they were just doing shit like Matt and Imp would just purposely pick like the worst possible bot lane, like the losing matchup into the matchup of like, who was the AD carrier Lemon Dogs?
Tabs.
Tabs, yes, Tabs and Mithy. And then obviously then Tabs and Mithy would just be like, well, we won the game, but all we've learned, no, we lost the game, and now our confidence is destroyed, and that's all we learned, because like they played the worst matchup and destroyed us just to prove a point. I'm assuming that's a rare instance, though, right, of them doing that.
I do think it happened to us, but I don't remember the specifics. I remember us saying this draft is completely won, there's nothing they can do, playing off meta.
And they were like, hold my beer.
Yeah.
Hold the soju. Okay. Come on, Kelsey, where's your brain going?
One thing that I kind of wanted to talk about, because coincidentally, both of your teams have sort of had similar issues with like best of ones, or like our first drafts are not as good as our series drafts.
Okay, they've lost at Worlds a lot. We get it, Kelsey. Okay, come to the point. Okay, yes, you dance around that very nicely, but they're aware that they are aware that they didn't get out of groups at Worlds.
Use that sort of explanation. So I was kind of curious, like what sort of similarities you might have to your approaches that you think might have something to do with that.
Like, is there a good reason why you're losing best of ones? Because here's the thing, right? I'll phrase it the Thorin way, okay? Right? Any team that says, I'm fucking amazing in best of 5 series, problem is I can't get past those best of ones. There's no world-class team, no like number 1 team in the world would ever have to say that problem, you know? Like any advantage you get in a best of 5, yes, clearly there's more variance in a best of 1, but something's going really wrong in the best of ones, right? So have you gauged anything as to what that problem might have been? What the issue, why it's a trend, a worrying trend in your teams?
I think at this Worlds, it was actually a lot of variance. However, if you look at Worlds 2016, we did not play the style that we've been playing the entire year. We had a wrong read on the meta. We didn't come in prepared. There was some arrogance, including from myself, in lack of preparation because we had an easy group. So
yes,
I think it went a lot better in 2017. Our drafts in MSI were really good from start to finish because we actually, despite still having some of the arrogance, we felt really strong, but we came in very prepared. We started doing draft talks every time, and also making sure that we played from our strengths instead of our opponent's weakness, which is something we did a lot in 2016.
As for us, last year, we had the GT's group from this year, and I just think that it was like they were just better on the day. This year, our team had like a very distinct weakness in how we approached the early game, and it had nothing to do with whether or not it was best of ones or not. We just had like a very distinct weakness. So I don't think best of ones really factored into that very much.
Okay.
Do you think that there was something to do with how North America played like late game or something? Because it wasn't like you were destroying domestically in early games either.
Yeah, we had the lowest first tower percentage in North America, but we had the highest first three tower percentage. It's just the teams that we played against at Worlds were, I mean, I think we also, I wouldn't say regressed, but our approach changed to more it was a slightly more conservative, because our expectation was like teams wouldn't be able to as effectively snowball on us, and that was like something that we found in scrims as well. And naturally, like everyone on stage plays a lot more conservative than scrims, and the teams that we did play against just got the leads that they got were just a lot larger than we were expecting, if that makes sense. Like we weren't expecting WE to pull out like Rumble, Caitlyn, Jace in that meta. Like that was not an expectation we had going in.
Do you think, I mean, you said that there was an issue with how you played early game. It seems like you don't want to share that, but I was wondering if like this was something you knew about before and you just like realized you didn't have time to fix it, or? I
mean, that's one of the reasons that, I'm stepping back this year, is because last year I felt like, as a coach, last summer was like the first time I'd like actually coached the team, and there was a lot of experience that I gained from like going to an international tournament, scrimming, like going through like Worlds, and then I thought these are all the issues that I can fix coming into 2017. And a lot of the issues that we had last year, in the way we approached the game during the regular season, the way we approached the boot camp this year, the way we like just had our structure was different, but like we weren't able, despite recognizing the flaws that we had in the early game, I wasn't able to fix them. And I think if I had continued to coach next year, there'd be diminishing returns in terms of how much more I could really help this team.
Okay. So in that case, I mean, just to extend the concept further, you think that like if you're going to be an actual coach, you would need a different type of a team or something. Just like for this particular squad, it doesn't make as much sense for you to be the coach.
Correct.
Okay.
Do you think?
Well, yeah, go on.
Oh, I was going to say, do you think that this is like a permanent thing, or are you going to learn in theory? Like, do you think that you can get to a point where
GM?
Well, I'm just saying, like, do you think you can get to the point where you could fix this team and you're looking to like improve yourself as a coach, or do you just like want to be a GM? Do you think this is a better role for you?
I mean, I got into esports not even like I wasn't going to go into coaching at all.
Okay.
I think
Loco happened.
Yeah, I'm not sure that had anything to do with it.
Keep going.
I think I was initially going to be the GM in 2016, but the coaching staff that we put together / put together
this is the spring one with the KC, and then that's another.
Yeah. Okay. Just for the lack of a better term, it did not work out. And there was like no one that we could find last minute. So like that's when I stepped in. And then even at the end of last year, I was considering looking for other coaches. But as far like all the people that I spoke with, there wasn't anyone available that I thought would fit that specific roster. And so this year was definitely like, I mean, a lot of people said that it had to do with like the community, which is why I like stepped back, and it wasn't true at all. I told a lot of people even before we went in, it's like, if we don't get out of groups this year, this will be like my last, like at least for TSN, this will be my last year coaching. So the decision was pretty straightforward for me.
Can I ask you this thought, right?
Sure.
When you say all that actually does play into a famous Parth meme, which was like, but he wasn't even supposed to be the coach, which is like, listen, that's definitely some good context.
I don't think that it excuses my performance as a coach, but I mean,
I was going to go the other way, mate. I was going to say this, right? I get it that you didn't necessarily want to be a coach initially. You took it on. You're almost like, actually, we have a term in football, I don't know if you have a term in American sports for this. It's called like caretaker coach, which is if like, you know, the manager of the team like dies or something horrific like that or has to be fired. Sometimes they let his like assistant coach take over. And then if he does very well, sometimes he just becomes the main coach, you know. But as a result, it comes with the expectation that, yeah, you don't expect the caretaker coach guy to be the best because you think, right, we might be waiting, just kind of like treading water until you get the proper manager next season. But you did win all those LCS titles. Why are you saying to people, oh, if I don't get out, well, like, you must have thought to yourself, I'm pretty good, right? I'm winning the LCS title every season.
I mean, I'm okay, but I'm pretty sure they could have had any other coach, and with the roster we had, we probably still would have won. That's not like me making it up. That's just like a fact.
Okay. You're like that girl who's like pretty hot, but you're like, oh, you could have any woman. It's like, yeah, you're pretty good as well. You got your own. You've got charms, Parth. You know, you've got skills.
I mean, yeah, I don't think I'm bad, but if you think that you're attributing TSM's success to me, I think a team with like Doublelift and Bjergsen is gonna win NA.
Well, after all that, he was a Redditor after all. After all. Okay. So okay then, why like without the context of we don't know what your relationship with TSM is, why not just go to another team and be a coach and find a team that's exactly your type of team? In fact, come back, suddenly you're the coach of insert team that's plays in LCS, and then you beat TSM and you're the best coach ever. Why not?
Yeah, again, I didn't have very many aspirations of being a coach. The reason I stayed with TSM is because it's a space that interested me a lot, and I respect both Andy and Bjergsen for what they're trying to do and accomplish. And so regardless of what I'll like end up doing in the next few years, I don't think I'll be doing much in esports outside of TSM.
Okay. What about Youngbuck? Why isn't he going for the 5th title in G2?
I am, but not in G2. At least I'm still talking to teams, of course. But I've had similar criticism as Parth, where I had the best lineup, so I'm supposed to win. And I think there is truth to that.
Here's the thing, though. Let me ask you a question about that, though. Like, do you both actually believe that, though? Because, like, here's the thing. On paper, I get it. You definitely had very good lineups because they did win. But isn't that sort of circular logic? Because everyone who's telling you that says that you're the best lineup because you won, and then they say, but you won because you have the best lineup. It's like that. You can't penetrate that circle, you know. You can't have had the best lineup every split.
Well, I didn't in my first split when we had Kiki's Emperor hybrid. So something must have done right there, right?
Yes, exactly.
And I say to those people that criticize me for having the best lineup, I did win. We had the expectation to get first, and we made it to first. Exactly. And I'm gonna maybe spit some fire, but H2K, for example, had a top 2 lineup for the last 4 splits, and they didn't make a single final. So, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. We met expectations.
Yeah, but you can't exceed them. So that's also a big reason why I'm looking for a different team that don't want to coach G2 again.
Okay, right, I've got a more abstract question then, because this is one that doesn't have to just be about your teams, but it can take in your experience and potentially there's the expanse of many teams. So a kind of depressing realization I actually came to, I think it was 2 years ago, because what I did was I went back and I looked through all the worlds that we'd had, and I looked at like the way they do the group draw, and you know, some people get a good group draw, some people don't, especially with the system where they made it so you can't have the regions playing the same group, etc., which unfortunately will always mean that some people get harder groups and some people don't, just by the nature of how it actually works out with Koreans can't be in the same group, etc. And when I looked at it, I actually figured out, quite sadly, that there were very few instances, basically ever, of, forget even just the West, anyone not Korean actually legitimately massively over-exceeding expectations or under-exceeding expectations once you knew the group. As in, once you knew the group, basically, like the Chinese teams, except for the OMG team that beat Najin Shield, it's just, when do you meet Koreans? Or, to put another way, when do you have the hardest opposition? So if you have a very hard group, you're just not going to get out of groups usually. If you meet a Korean in the first round, you're not going past the first round. So it actually makes it very difficult if you're a Westerner, even after 6 world championships, to even know, like, how do you transition success domestically to internationally, because we've got a lot of teams that have won loads of LCS titles, never been anywhere in Worlds. So, like, personally, I'm saying that means I don't have a clue. I don't know how someone transitions to having international success. Can you speculate, or do you know by what you didn't do right, what could have been the secret?
No, I think at least in our case, there were a lot of little things that could have gone better. Maybe looking back, like different system for draft where One thing I regret is people choose like giving options for a different player. Like let's say my support would give my top laner 2 options to say like, hey, you should play this or that, or really push for that. It's like things like that. That was just an example. May have not happened. But I think it were a lot of little things. We came in very prepared, very strong macro, and there was just a lot of variance on the day itself. So I think really just draw a good group and try to avoid Koreans as long as possible.
When you say that, though, okay, as a follow-up question, right, sometimes I get the feeling that that's actually one of the theories I've always had as to why a lot of coaches do actually let their player in like the big 5th game or the big elimination game kind of like have a degree of input as to if he has his comfort champion or just whatever he wants to pick, is because in a weird way, right, they don't want it to be where you lose the game anyway, and then the guy's like, oh, but if I'd have played this, you know. So sometimes I get the feeling some coaches won't tell the person, like, I actually think we'll win if we just pick this, because they don't want to put that guy in a position where then he's like, oh, but actually I lost because I was uncomfortable, you know. It's like, it's kind of like a way to emotionally cover your bases, as it were. Like, is that anything you're kind of implying here, like with regret?
No, it's more coaches' regret, I think. I personally regret at Worlds, I underperformed some drafts. And some of it was completely my fault, and some of it was just not having the proper system in place. And I think like the best example is we gave Galio to Samsung in our most important final game. They had Twitch. We knew they were going to pick Kha'Zix. Everything was lined up for them picking Galio. Before we went on stage, we said we're banning Galio in the second phase. And for some reason, we forgot to ban Galio. I forgot to think about it and mention it. And just big blunder, right?
Just many regrets. Just blanked on it,
Yeah.
I mean, part of the reason I asked you guys about like hours of preparation for draft and stuff is just, do you think that there's a way to ensure that kind of stuff doesn't happen? Do you think like more time of discussion works? Like, what do you think is a way to kind of improve mentally, or just make sure you're more prepared for those types of scenarios?
I mean, from my perspective, we had like a decent system of how like I remembered things, and like based on the notes that I had, even the drafts that were like criticized were things that were in our system, like the one where we gave them Rumble, Jace, and Caitlyn, right? I knew they were going to take Rumble, but I thought it would be fine if we gave them Rumble and Jace, because we just wanted to ban out the solution, because we thought if that game with Twitch and Cho'Gath ever got to like an item and a half, they would just lose the game. And it was similar for the Jace Sejuani game. It's not like, oh, we were like panicked into our 4th pick. It was just like, we knew that we had a strong tie side with Jace and Sejuani, and that's something that gave us a lot of success before. And since we were losing every early game, it was like, okay, this is our last game. We're going to give you 3 priority like lanes with like the best early game jungler, and we're going to see what we can do with it. Because if we lost another early game, that's not something like we would regret it a lot more if we drafted the same way again, gave up another early game lead, and then lost because of it. So okay. I think another reason why it's like, for me, post Worlds is I still think the structure I had exceeded the limits of what I think I can do, which is why I think like diminishing returns is what I'll get next year, because I don't see many ways that I personally can help a team get further without like learning more, which is going to be why when Song comes in next year, maybe I'll see like the things that he does or the way he approaches things differently, and it'll give me like a better perspective or like a different perspective. But my current path of how to work with the team wasn't going to get us much further.
Okay. What about then other coaches? Like, are there like coaches in the scene where like you think this guy's actually amazing and he has a whole system that's like unique or does it a different way? Are there people like that out there? Are all the coaches doing fairly similar things?
I don't know much about other coaches, but I would like to comment on Parth because...
Wait a minute. What, you don't know? I don't know your own competition?
I don't know what their rules are, how they run their teams.
Okay.
But I want to comment on Parth because I actually think it's interesting that you say you don't think you're good enough to coach another team, because I think I think the best coaches have the best teams because they learn together. And it's also one of the reasons why I think Koma is the best coach in the world, because he learns everything with Faker, with Bang, with Wolf. And then all he has to do is incorporate everything on 2 new players every time. So you've had the privilege to play with the best players in NA, so technically you should have more game knowledge than almost any other player in NA.
Wait. I never said I'm like not a good coach and I can't transfer my skills to like a different team, right? I'm just saying that if I want to stay with TSM, I don't think that me being there is going to help them improve a lot more than I already have. Like, say if I were to coach a different team, I might be able to like actually be like, I'll have a lot more impact in terms of like helping them improve. I just don't think.
Too, right?
Yeah, it depends on which roster again.
It's actually good. Start spitting some fire. Keep going. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think that I can take the current TSM team, or at least the one we had last year, a lot further than I think we did.
I mean, you had a few cracks at it.
I'm glad we maneuvered yourself into a position where you have to stick up for yourself at least. It's good.
I mean, I'm not like trying to spin like a narrative either way. I'm just
yeah, of course.
It's just like, I'm just the poor little analyst boy. I never asked for all this power. God, why did you choose me, God?
Exactly.
Yeah,
wait,
so
Youngbuck, I have a question then for you.
Oh, here we go. It's open house season now. Come on, everyone, just start throwing topics out.
Because you just asked me, if you were to replace yourself as a G2 coach, who would you hire?
I actually recommended Taylor to Carlos, but he didn't want to coach because. Okay. So I said it under the assumption that mid-team strength were going to stay, because I don't think that a coach with game knowledge is what they need right now. So the only areas they're really going to grow in is having structure in their life and having very disciplined players and a coach who's really good at keeping people responsible to the rules and strictness. So I also agree, like, you would have a really tough roster to coach if your strength is game knowledge, if you bring in mid-team Sven to TSM and don't have any other changes. But if you had brought in like maybe two, like Nuclear and Shay from H2K, you probably would have been able to teach them a lot.
Well, you'd have had to, wouldn't you? So I like
decent bot lane.
Yeah, I like the way you set that comparison up there. Another shout out to H2K. Turns out recruiting's actually pretty hard.
But wait, like conceptually, right? Like, can you name more than like 2 or 3 coaches that you would recommend for your roster?
Yeah.
Because like I can't. Like I look at like the list of available coaches in the West for like the roster that like we're putting together, and I don't see very many.
That was my first thought when you said that they could have had any other coach and had the same result. And I was thinking, okay, so which one would they get? Because, like, are there just so many coaches that you guys could foreseeably say are better than you or are just as good? Because I feel like that's a big problem in the scene right now. Not to, like, slam anyone, but there's just a lack of experience in general. So you guys can criticize yourselves as much as you want, but you have, like, pretty unique positions as well.
Yeah, basically, she just reworded the old saying, you know, you don't have to be able to outrun a lion, you just have to be able to outrun the other guy next to you. Yeah.
No, but to answer your question, Parth, I could probably recommend Taylor and maybe Hussein. I haven't heard anything negative about him. I haven't heard much about him, but that's usually a positive thing, because when players talk to each other, it's usually slinging mud behind each other's backs, right? So not having heard anything negative about Hussein probably means he is actually a good coach.
That's the state of Western League of Legends.
Right. Yes. The lack of knowledge I have on him suggests he's very good. Yeah.
Yes.
Come on, players, at least fucking compliment your coaches to other people. Come on. That's just rude. Pick up your coaches. That's the message of this show.
But yeah, I mean, we were considering Hussein, but he was still under contract until the 21st, and we couldn't wait that long. And the other thing with Hussein was, I think he was in a very unique position this year, because he had pretty like mild-mannered like veterans in Power of Evil and Ignar, and then he had 3 rookies to work with. And if you're like a decent coach with good game knowledge, which Hussein seemed to be, it's like a much easier roster to handle, but like in your first year.
Yeah, he had a very coachable team.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I mean, isn't that another topic we could talk about then? Because one of the issues with trying to dissect a result for how the coach did in it is that, for example, if someone has, as you mentioned here, if someone has Mithy, perhaps that means they don't need to have as much raw in-game knowledge. If someone in the past, like Daylor, had Yellow Star in his team and he had Rainover who'd played with Huni, you know, perhaps he's coaching a different aspect of the game more to be successful. Whereas, for example, think what you like about him, there's a reason why everyone in the scene often hypes up Prolly and says, oh, he's very good in terms of his understanding of the game and blah, 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 all the rest of it. You know, it doesn't actually matter if he wins or loses in that scenario. The same rep exists, but it's harder to figure out with some of the other coaches, right?
Sorry, what's the question there?
When you have, well, basically, some coaches don't have to actually have great in-game knowledge to win.
Oh.
or win Coach of the Year award. Of course, everyone in this chat totally deserved all of theirs, and would never suggest anything otherwise on this episode. So,
on this episode,
I didn't vote, so technically, no one needs to know what my opinion was on that. Do you not think that though? Is it like, without naming names, you must look out at the scene and sometimes see a team where a player's playing amazingly, or the meta fits his champion pools perfectly, and the team does well, so the coach gets plaudits, but maybe you look at the actual drafts and the way he's put the team together, you think, maybe not that good, actually. I mean, this is more of a general Western topic, I guess.
Like, I guess he's saying, how much do you judge a fellow coach on his perceived level of game knowledge?
Oh, you can't. I mean, I think I actually talked about this previously. It's like the Coach of the Split award is garbage because the people who are voting, they're voting for an award where they don't understand what the people do, and they have metrics that also don't really make any sense. So it's like, how are I don't know, X, Y, and Z reporters or casters supposed to know what metrics to judge all these coaches on, because their rosters are different, their plays in the org and the team is different. So, and not only that, I don't think, at least in North America, a lot of the coaches don't really talk amongst themselves, but I've heard it's different in EU.
There's a little bit more communication between the coaches, yeah, and especially around Worlds, but it's not that much. The players go out a lot, or at least they did so when everyone was playing on the same days in the best of ones. So the players would go out a lot, and then there would be a few coaches here and there that would go out with casters and whatnot. But nowadays it's a lot more quiet.
Yeah, I mean, and even in NA, I think a lot of the players don't really intermingle. I know, with TSM and Cloud9, they aren't really very close with each other or other teams. And as for coaches in NA, we had Reapered, Song this year, so there's already a language barrier, even talking to them casually. So the only coach I was fairly close with was Tony, and even that was more of a casual conversation, more so than in-depth conversation about how coaching works and his structure, etc.
Okay.
I think at least in EU, pretty social. So there is a lot of stuff that gets passed on from player to player, and there's a lot of stuff and concepts that grow between teams of what these other guys are doing that may not necessarily even be true. And I think that that's part of the difficulty in even gauging it, is understanding what's being made up, what's being thrown around by word of mouth, and some relationships or reputations can get easily damaged or miscommunicated.
Okay, so a question I have for you is, when you were talking before, Parth, about the structure that they made in TSM, so people might notice by the number of people who've been on this show in the 16 episodes we had before, a number of people came on the show and were like, I have previously been an analyst for TSM, I have previously been a positional coach for TSM. There's loads of people. It's in this scenario, right? Obviously, another aspect of how to improve coaching in the West is you can't just copy the Korean model. It's not okay, well, if a Korean team has two coaches, a head coach and an analyst, or strategical coach, they call it, right? That's what we need to do, right? Are you in favor in general of, should there be bigger coaching staffs in the West? For example, when you listed all those different aspects, the first thing I think there is, it's very hard to find all those in one person. So, maybe you do need the guy who's got leadership qualities and he's going to coach the personality, and then you need the psychologist guy, and then you need the super nerd analyst guy who doesn't think he's that good, but actually he's got all the game knowledge, because he's fought his way up, he's very plucky, whoever that might be. Do you need this wide? Do you think we should go with bigger coaching staffs to overcome these issues?
So, I mean, originally that's what, that was the common sense approach that we tried in 2016, which was all right, we can't find one person who fits these qualities. Let's hire two that hopefully complement each other and work together, which is why initially the idea of Casey and Jarge was Jarge is going to be the strategic coach.
Yes.
And then Casey is going to be the non-strategy side, whatever that was going to be. And after that is when that didn't work last summer, we tried it with me and Weldon. And then at least I don't think dual coaching, where both coaches are equal in power, I guess, really works.
Okay. it needs to be like the Sith. There's one to hold power and one to crave power. Okay, no, obviously the joke with the crave power, but there needs to be one person who has the hierarchical charge, right?
It's because I've gone through that system. I've seen how Jarge and Casey worked, or lack thereof. Yes. I know our system with me and Weldon. I've talked to Robert Yip from Immortals when he worked with Dylan, and when he worked with Song, and all of those where they had distinct jobs on the team, I felt weren't very good, because there was always if you have two people who have different opinions on how to structure and do a lot of those things, and you don't really complement each other, they're not going to work either. Because now you have to complement the position on your team that is going to make a lot of overarching decisions, and that's not where you really want to be. You want there to be conflict, I guess.
Okay. What's your take, Youngbuck? What actual coaching staff do you have, by the way? Obviously you've worked with Weldon to some degree, right? You've been there, but have you had a decent sized coaching staff? Is it mainly you?
Well, the first year was me. I was the head coach, the assistant coach, the sports psychologist. Name it all, whatever you want to put it.
Okay.
The second year, I had two assistant coaches. Weldon was one of them, and we had Sharks in the first half, and then our head analyst became our manager / assistant coach as well. Just looking at how teams are building right now, there's two kinds of ways. One is the head coach and the strategic coach style, where everyone has their distinct responsibilities. I don't like this, maybe because I'm just used to being the head coach and being responsible for everything. Yeah. But I also think if one guy is not good at his job, then the other is also bound to fail or have bad results. And then there's the one where you have the head coach with assistant coach, which I prefer way more. Just give the responsibility for the results into the one person you trust, and preferably also have him choose the assistant coach to complement what he thinks he needs from the team, whether it's a strategic element or maybe more managerial element. So I would prefer that way more, but I see a lot of teams are going for the head coach and strategic coach and splitting up the responsibilities.
Yeah, I agree with him a lot. I think a head coach and an assistant coach is definitely based on all my experiences in the last 2 years and talking to everyone, it's a lot more well-rounded for sure. Okay.
Are all the Asian teams doing it that way, Kelsey?
I'm not sure if all of the Asian teams are doing that way, but I think
aware of.
There isn't really a concept of this kind of strategic versus head coach thing as much in the LPL. They don't have as much of this, our coach should only have authority. I think one team tried that model with the StarCraft coach, but most of them mostly just do our coach we want people with game knowledge and people with some level of authority. It's kind of a mix. There isn't really some concrete idea of sharing burden. There's almost always a head coach and then some guys who help him with the work or help him with the way that the team runs. So I think generally this is an accepted model, what they're talking about with a head coach and assistant coach.
How much of it? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, one thing I will say is obviously in the West, since there's not a lot of established coaches, a lot of coaches are different. One other weakness that I see is a lot of coaches try to do everything. They'll try to be both the head coach and try to put in structure and try to input game knowledge. And if you don't have expertise in the areas that you're trying to influence the players in, that's where I see players losing a lot of respect for you. I think a lot of successful coaches are those who just play to their strengths instead of trying to do what an ideal coach should be doing. And so I think there's just a fair ecosystem where if the players recognize your contributions to the team, wherever your expertise happens to be in, those teams I feel work out a lot better than coaches who try to pretend that they know every facet of coaching that they're trying to implement in.
Does the analysts that you have impact much upon how well a team will do, the success of a team? Because obviously there's a lot of people who have actually been analysts for different teams, including many top teams. But also the public perception is that's just the guy who does the research. He just literally tells you, here's all the picks they do, or here's something. How much of it is actual analysis? How much is them feeding you a report and they've got the information and stuff? Do you think that is a big factor on coaching?
I think it has a decent effect on preparation. if you are the kind of team who tries to exploit opponents' weaknesses or strengths. And I think every team should always play from their own strength, but also definitely keep in mind the opponent's strengths and weaknesses. So my analyst gave me all the data I needed, all the picks and bans. He would look at like how they would set up Baron. Would they bait a lot? Would they just start it a lot? Did they play around tempo properly? Did they have good control of Drake? So in preparation, he was very useful. And when he started moving into the house, he was also more of an assistant coach because we needed that, and he was just there watching scrims anyway, and he was able to give feedback that some people didn't see in the game, whether it was me or Mithy. He was very useful. So in G2 at least, our analyst was very useful and contributed a lot. In other teams, I don't know, maybe they just get like a win rate for a solo queue champion and that's it. And but our analyst was very good.
Okay.
We had a lot of trouble retaining a lot of analysts. So we tried that whole position coaching thing last year, which was the idea that when you're doing the way the structure works is like you have like a normal day, you play scrims and then you have reviews between scrims. The review was mostly based on team elements and mostly talking about like macro elements of the game. So what usually got ignored is very like individual things in terms of both like individual communication habits that you need to keep up on and like laning and mechanics too, because those are equally as important. So our entire idea of position coaching was founded on the fact that we didn't want individuals to sacrifice like their play individually just to like learn macro. So what we tried is we gave every player a position coach who just watched the game from their perspective and listened to only their comps and like took both detailed notes and formed like a relationship with like the players in how you can set individual goals and improve. But what we ended up finding out through time was that not every player wanted that kind of relationship. So basically Bjergsen's position coach, Bjergsen basically trained his position coach to be like, these are the things that I can't track and I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to improve on by myself. So here's what I need you to do. And then they basically had like a symbiotic relationship where like he would improve like his game knowledge by talking to Bjergsen, and Bjergsen got a lot of work out of like his position coach. Meanwhile, other players like Biofrost, those are position coaches that I had to work with myself and be like, this is what I need like Vincent to be doing individually, and he's been sucking at. So make sure that you remind him or do these like 3 things for the next few weeks just to make sure that he keeps up on it. And then players like Double Lift and Kevin, they didn't really like forming that extra relationship. So we ended up not even having a position coach for them. So I think staff, every like team uses them differently. And so that was just like our unique way of implementing them into our system.
I wanted to ask actually how much you guys separate one-on-ones versus like collective time, and like how much time do you spend on players individually versus like how do you split something up? If there's something that you notice one player is doing a mistake, like do you have the entire team together talk about that, or do you take him aside later? Like what kind of setups do you do in that case?
For us, most of it is as a team, especially if it's a mistake which comes from lack of discipline. You maybe even go and watch it at 0.5 times speed just to make that person feel the pain of what he was doing and causing the team. And just letting him know, like, hey, your lack of discipline cost us the inability to set up for this.
Wait a minute, do you do that when it's actually in the group setting, or is that just in the one-on-one?
In a group setting. I mean, we didn't like slow motion it all.
That's a bit harsh, isn't it?
But there were moments where he said, okay, well, players are not taking Scrim serious enough, or we are not able to practice properly because due to lack of discipline, people want to make outplays in scrims too much or test their matchups. So if they ruin our scrim, we're just gonna walk us through it and ask the player, why did you do this? Okay. And just put him on a chopping block, basically.
See, the funny thing is, I can give you an anecdote where people might think that's very harsh, but that's actually happened in real sports. Because first of all, I mean, this is a difference between esports and traditional sports, unfortunately, is that obviously the average sports athlete is probably like 27, so he's an actual man that's lived a life and can take someone telling him you did badly in a fucking game, they don't go off and cry or sulk or whatever, they're not allowed to do that in theory. So it's true that a lot of traditional sports coaches, there are a lot that just basically like sort of shout at the players a bit. But famously, the Michael Jordan's Chicago Bulls teams that won all those titles in the 1990s in the NBA, his coach, Phil Jackson, actually as a training technique used to do something like this. What he would do was, when he cut together the videos which showed all the things he wanted to go over from the last game, he would actually get all the scenes where they did like a really bad misplay or fucked it up, and he would cut into the video scenes from like horror movies of someone like getting their throat slashed open or someone just getting like stabbed in the eye. And then he wouldn't even say anything about it. He would just play the video and he would just try to make like, yeah, I think you see what I'm getting at there. You know when like this person just hung themselves. Yeah, I think you know what I'm getting at. It's pretty ruthless. It is ruthless though, Youngbuck. That's savage. I appreciate that.
I think it can. I think it can be useful, but it can also like create resentment if it's the same player over and over again, right? Like to a point. No, it really depends. Yeah.
It did happen where I was told like, "Hey, I feel like you're targeting me too much in the post-game review," and then I had to explain him why I did it, or I would just say, "Hey, maybe you're right. Maybe I should have targeted this player more as well." A famous example was I was told I wasn't targeting Misty, for example, and and then I just simply said, well, listen, when we go to the VOD review and Misty had made a mistake, he says it before I do, or I have to ask him. He just walks up to me and to the team and says, guys, I should not have traded here. I know I completely fucked up the early game. Trick, I'm sorry you couldn't finish your camps, something like that. So he wouldn't need to be approached about it and ask like, hey, what are you doing, man? But other players, they would just sit back, relax, just watch until the replay is over and not say anything. So they did need to be confronted with the lack of discipline.
See, Mithy, assistant coach of the year, 2016 and 2017. Yeah, Andy played at the same time. It's not bad.
I mean, we had
Parth, there's no way you do video sessions and you're like slow mo, like look at that trade you're losing there, you fucking idiot. Look, you're right within his danger zone.
Oh, I don't have to. My players do it for me.
Okay.
Oh, yeah,
it'll just be like, oh, Kevin, why are you just trying to fight this guy 1v1 at level 1? It's fucking up what we want to do later. Or we'll be like trying to set up for Baron and like Peter is just like farming the extra wave instead of basing, and we'll be like, why did you farm that extra wave if he like doesn't bring it up? So I'm pretty sure most teams, if not directly, go through these reviews and they should point out all of these mistakes in a team setting, because it not only influences like the player that you're pointing out, but also the other four. And those are situations that happen less and less often the more you do them, I guess.
Okay. Actually, sorry, go ahead.
I was just do you ever get to a point where it's like the other players get kind of tuned out or bored if you're spending too much time on something that they think has nothing to do with like their individual performance? Like, how do you get them involved in those types of scenarios, I guess?
I mean, they don't happen too often. In most scenarios, I don't know if Youngbuck agrees, like the scenarios that he's talking about are like fairly obvious. Just the players aren't like admitting that they were not playing for the team and they didn't have like discipline to do X, Y, or Z. So they don't like take very much time in review. Sure. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's not like I'm arguing with like 10 minutes with Kevin about why he took this like one trade when his jungler was on the opposite side of the map or something.
Okay. At the risk of spoiling what was such a nice, pleasant episode, I will invoke the name of LS. Just a couple of seconds to just react, calm down again, everyone. Just let's hear what he has to say. He's a good guy, allegedly. Right. So one thing LS said to me, which is one of his theories as to why he thinks that Western teams aren't as good, is that he claims that a lot of the Korean players know how to play a lot more roles than their own role, and that they actually, like, as a result, have a better understanding, perhaps, of what their teammate in a certain setting could, should, would have done, Whereas he said a lot of the Western players, to his knowledge, are kind of like they're just an AD carry or they're just a top laner or whatever, and as a result, that's his theory as to why he thinks they don't necessarily understand the interactions as much. What do you think of that?
I think part of it's true. I do think that a lot of players focus a lot more on their play instead of trying to understand what's going on in the rest of the map, which is why Western teams also have, at least in scrims, have a lot more issues with discipline in scrims, is because they are playing more of like an individual game rather than like a team game. And that's something that I think a lot of top teams have addressed and tried to fix. So I do think that's like one of the reasons why, like, regionally, maybe like some of the regions are behind, but that's not like an issue that is like unknown, I guess.
Okay. Is there a way to combat that? Is it just a cultural difference where it's probably not gonna happen?
No, I mean, I think the first part is like recognizing that that's something that needs to change, which is why like team reviews, everyone has like an input, and not only what they're doing, but everything everyone else on the team is doing too. So they get like an appreciation of what else is going on the map in different roles.
That's kind of been the generic response to every like interview. It's as well, how are you working on this? Well, we just have to realize that we have to make this sacrifice for the team to be better, and this is what we're working on this year.
Knowing
so
is
I
the
think
first
it's just
step,
like,
right?
I mean, that is true though. Like, there's no like sensationalist like answer to like the question. It's just like, you are doing this review, and these are all the factors that go into it, and it's just a very boring answer, but that's a fact.
Okay.
You have to eventually break them down into specific moments if you want any kind of meaningful answer. But yeah, it's a very standard. The point is not that it's a boring answer. The point is that it's like, this is what people are aware of. And maybe people watching are like, well, duh. But it is something that people are slowly realizing and understanding more and more, I think, is just like how to incorporate team elements and interactions better.
It's just like these things, at least when you're looking at public perception, aren't like very exciting or like novel concepts to talk about. They're just like, these are like the very nitty-gritty nuances of things that go into like improving a team, and it happens slowly over a long period of time. And that's not something that they want to hear. They just want to hear like, oh, if they just like play this mechanically better, then they would have won this game or lost this game.
Sure.
So,
hey, this is Cap, and you're watching Thorin, the only man besides Richard Lewis who somehow found a way to get both League of Legends and Dota Redditors to hate him.